External Affairs and Transportation for ConocoPhillips Alaska. So today we're going to hear about how ranked choice voting has worked in the state of Maine since adoption more than 2 years ago. Maine implemented ranked choice voting, or RCV as it's called, in 2018 following a citizens initiative that began in 2016. So a couple of questions. What can Alaska learn from Maine's experience? How have Maine voters adapted to RCV? What lessons can Mainers provide Alaskans as we consider how ranked choice voting will alter our elections? Answers to these questions will help us understand the potential effects of this ballot measure and how elections are funded and administered in Alaska. At this time, I'd like to introduce our head table. We have Matthew Dunlap, former Maine Secretary of State. We have Kyle Bailey, Maine State Representative for District 27. Kevin Meyer, Alaska's Lieutenant Governor, and Gail Fenumiai, Director of the Alaska Division of Elections. So thank you to our head table for joining us today. Before turning it over to our guest today, I'd like to just thank the Commonwealth North members who are online with us today. I invite you to turn on your camera for a moment so we can acknowledge the contributions our members have made through their support of and engagement with Commonwealth North. So thank you all. As Juanetta said earlier, Commonwealth North was founded to provide a nonpartisan public policy forum to help Alaskans better understand some of those complex issues impacting our state. For those of you who are not members, I thank you for your interest, and we would certainly enjoy and appreciate your membership if you so choose to join us on a more permanent basis. So with that, I will turn it over to our panel, starting with Representative Bailey. Representative Bailey?
Well, thank you very much for having me join you today. I've always said to friends that if I didn't live in Maine, I'd live in Alaska. I have visited a number of times, and I have a number of friends live in the Anchorage area. So it's great to be with you all and talking about an issue that I sort of stumbled into. Did not expect to be working on election reform, and found myself in a series of campaigns that I was involved with and supporting candidates where there were more than 2 candidates, and in a ballot system that created real challenges. So I wanted to just give a couple opening remarks and then just a few quick lessons learned from Maine, and then hear from the other panelists. But you know, I think America's first frontier, Maine, and its last frontier, Alaska, despite some of our geographic and differences, have a few things in common that have made ranked choice voting a good fit for our state, and I think will work well in Alaska. You know, we're pretty independent up here. We're not afraid to think differently, act boldly. We'll always do what's best for our families and communities, even if that means doing something a little bit differently than other places. I think the other thing that stands out is, you know, when we see something that's broken, we try to go about trying to fix it. We don't let it just sit there. And so some of the lessons that we've learned from Maine's experience adopting ranked choice voting and implementing it now in 2 election cycles is, I think first, ranked choice voting does fulfill the promise of giving voters more choice in elections. And from the experience of a elected official and a voter myself, it really eliminates some of the negative aspects that we see under a sort of a pick one plurality system when there are more than 2 candidates running. So, you know, I've ranked my vote now in 2 primaries and 2 general elections in races with 7, 5, 4, 3 candidates. And in none of them have I had to worry about, you know, the vote splitting phenomena. In none of them was the spoiler effect an issue. I didn't have to worry about, you know, wasting my vote for a candidate who couldn't win and having to need to vote strategically based on what the polling said. I could actually rank my preferences in order of who I thought would do the best job. And I think because we've seen RCV winners have to build majority coalitions in just the first 2 cycles where we've used this, we've seen candidates start to change the way that they campaign to reach beyond their base and listen to more voters. And I think that's the second lesson that that's been clear for me about our experience using ranked choice voting now in Maine is that it does change the conversation in elections. Certainly for voters, you know, DC and media consultants are slowly figuring this out, but Maine voters really quickly adopted and embraced the different kind of campaign that does come with ranked choice voting. You know, I think Mainers, probably like Alaskans, are sick of the negativity in politics and really want to talk more about the issues, and they want to talk about, you know, your family and your brother and your, you know, your business and all that stuff. And so, you know, while ranked choice voting isn't a silver bullet, you know, there's no vaccinations for polarization. So, you know, it is something that we can do and that we've seen have an impact in Maine to change the conversation, because it shifts the incentives. Instead of needing to, you know, energize my base of 35% of the vote, turn them out to vote and beat the heck out of my opponents, suddenly I have to get to that majority threshold. And that means attracting second choice rankings, and even in crowded races, sometimes third choice rankings from voters who may like another candidate better. And then finally, you know, there was some angst at the beginning of our conversation here in Maine about, would ranked choice voting be confusing for voters? Certainly it's been implemented in municipalities across the country, but Maine was the first place where a state had implemented it statewide. And what we have found in our experience is that it really isn't that difficult for voters. There's been exit surveys by Edison Research, the Bangor Daily News, which is our state's second largest newspaper. And what we find is voters, even those voters who don't support ranked choice voting, found the process of actually ranking their candidates to be pretty intuitive, pretty easily. You know, that said, with any changes to election.
Sorry, Kyle, I've accidentally muted you. Could you unmute?
Oh, yep.
Sorry, thanks, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So I was just saying that the third lesson learned from Maine about the difficulty for voters, that you know, with any change to election, I think there are concerns, rightfully so, about the need to educate voters about those changes. And you know, ranked choice voting changes the way voters cast their ballots, or can change how voters approach casting their ballot, right? So it's no longer just picking one, but ranking their choices in order of preference. So voter education is important. But what I think we found in Maine and in cities across the United States is, even where there is little, or I might argue too little, voter education, voters have intuitively understood how the ballot works when they look at the ballot, read the instructions, and see the ballot. And I think that's because, if you think about it, voters sort of rank choices every day of our lives as consumers. You know, if I go to an ice cream shop and I like chocolate ice cream, but they're out of chocolate ice cream, I sort of know my second choice. And I think most voters intuitively know, if they see a ballot, you know, with a Democrat and a Republican and a Libertarian, you know, or in a Green Party candidate, they sort of know where they fall and how they want to rank those choices, whether they want to rank one or more than one, or how they feel about a candidate, because they probably have an opinion about one or more of those candidates based on how they've compared them to the other candidates, even if they are relying on party label and what they believe about those things. So those, I think, are the three things that stand out. I know former Secretary of State Matt Dunlap can share a lot more insights about the technicalities of ranked choice voting, implementing it from the perspective of an election administrator. But our election administrators have done a really fantastic job in Maine of implementing ranked choice voting, and I give kudos to Secretary Dunlap for, you know, leading that effort. And I think they've done a great job in a state that has you know, municipalities all across the state, hundreds and hundreds of municipalities that vote. We don't have county-based election systems here. It's all done at the local level, and we have some antiquated and rigorous systems in place for how we report elections and process those. And so we've been able to accommodate those very well. And I credit Secretary Dunlap and our election administrators who do a really incredible job of administrating our elections with integrity and transparency. So yeah, I'll leave it there and let others jump in, and look forward to questions folks have.
Thank you, Representative Bailey. The task of implementing Maine's ranked choice voting initiative fell to Maine's former Secretary of State, Matthew Dunlap, having turned out of that position earlier this year. He recently assumed the role of state auditor. Mr. Dunlap, please go ahead and unmute your microphone, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. And I think Representative Bailey gave a pretty good rundown of how this is working. So let me start at the very end, which is really the most interesting part in my view. And I've had the unique opportunity, I will say, of having served at the national level with Lieutenant Governor Meyer, who's a towering figure nationally and has a great deal of respect among the other lieutenant governors and especially the secretaries of state who serve as election administrators. And I've had the chance to talk with him and his staff about our experience with ranked choice voting at a fairly involved level, which we won't get into today because we only have a little bit of time. But I do want to make sure I leave plenty of time to answer questions. So what's the punchline on ranked choice voting? For me, and I conveyed this to the lieutenant governor, it was after we began implementing it. Because I live in a community. I don't have a chauffeur or anything like that. I cut my own grass, I do all the cooking, and I'm in the grocery store quite a bit. And for those of you who have served in elected office, you know very well that going to the grocery store is another phrase for office hours. So in that vein, after we first began implementing ranked choice voting, and it was quite a journey, both in terms of the statutory framework that was amended by the voters and also the constitutional backdrop. Maine's constitution is a little bit more complex because of about 198 amendments that have been adopted since 1820. I've had the chance to look at some of the election laws in Alaska, and you have a bit of a cleaner slate than Maine does. So you have a great advantage there. But the punchline for me really or the payoff really, was being able to go to the grocery store. And a lot of my neighbors don't even know what I've done for the last, better part of 2.5 decades in public service. But I ran into folks in the grocery store after that first primary when we implemented ranked choice voting for the first time. And people said, I really like the idea. I like that a lot, because the idea that I get to vote for somebody I admire without risking electing someone I detest was a really great thing. And that was really sort of the spirit behind ranked choice voting, which is to find some form of consensus around electing our elected leaders. So that goes back to the 90s when we first began seeing these multi-candidate races that Representative Bailey alluded to. We elected, I think, a string of about 4 or 5 governors who never got more than 40% of the vote. And that was starting to concern people that, they lacked a sort of sense of public legitimacy because they were elected on a minority based on the plurality system of voting. So ranked choice voting was adopted by the voters. It faced significant political challenges because we had a split legislature, we had a Republican-controlled Senate and a Democratic-controlled House with a very conservative Republican governor who did not like ranked choice voting at all. And there was a real lack of agreement about how to proceed against the constitutional backdrop with ranked choice voting. When the legislature finally, after nearly a year, came to an agreement, the agreement was to delay the implementation of ranked choice voting, not use it at all for the general election for state races, only federal races, and all races for primaries because of that plurality language in our Constitution. And then if the Constitution wasn't amended to address those issues by December of 2021, the whole thing would sunset. Well, as Representative Bailey will probably nod vigorously, the proponents of ranked choice voting were not amused by this compromise, and they went back out and did a people's veto initiative, which successfully gathered the requisite signatures to force the whole matter back on the ballot and put a stay on the delay and trigger mechanism, which gave the Secretary of State's office exactly 100 days to design the entire process. The process that we came up with was a fairly simple system, a grid-style ballot. When we put out our sample ballots, as Representative Bailey alluded to, the great relief we felt is that the questions that we got from the public were actually very thoughtful and intelligent questions, which told us that we weren't confusing people. And in fact, that has proven to be the case in the elections that we've used ranked choice voting. Voters get it. And the most common question that we got, in accordance with the rules that we adopted, is do we have to rank our choices, or can we just vote for one candidate? And the political theory that we've gone through with our rulemaking is that the voter should control their ballot. So if you want to cast a blank ballot, you certainly can. If you only want to vote for one candidate, you certainly can. You don't have to rank all the choices. If you skip more than one, then everything that comes after that is considered exhausted. And then even our recount procedures, which were fairly intuitive and simple, worked very, very well, the only time we had to use them. And what we've seen now, we've used it 3 times, and 2 primaries and 1 general election. It does still have some political fallout coming down around it. Inadvertently partisan, oddly enough, simply because the Republican Party lost a member of Congress using ranked choice voting. And initially it was seen as something of a sideways blow to the former governor, who's very, very conservative. In fact, that was never the case. It's just sort of fallen out that way because of the election results. The unfortunate part about that is that until our Republican friends win an election using ranked choice voting, the odds are they will see it as an existential threat, and that cycle turns and they take control of the legislature. They don't win an election using ranked choice voting, they will probably make as one of their first moves an effort to repeal ranked choice voting. So it has survived a couple of public votes. There was a preemptive people's veto to prevent it being used for the race for president. That was not successful. We didn't wind up needing it in the race for president because our law says that if any candidate gets more than 50% of the vote, you don't use ranked choice voting because you've already gotten to a consensus. So that happened in this last presidential election. Maine, like Nebraska, splits its electoral votes. President Trump won a majority in the 2nd congressional district, and President Biden won the overall state total. So there was no need for rankings in that case. I'm sure I've left you a lot of room for a lot of questions. And I think right now, Mr. Jepson, we're at a point now where we can turn it back over to you and see what folks have to say about all this.
Thank you, Matthew. And thanks again to Representative Bailey. As you know, the state of Alaska has embarked on a similar path. And we've invited our Lieutenant Governor, Kevin Meyer, who's in charge of elections, and Division of Elections Director, Gail, Fenumiai, to join us today. We've asked them to lead off this next session with some questions for both of you. We'll listen into your conversation and then we'll turn it over to the audience for Q&A. As a reminder, audience members may submit questions via the Zoom chat window or text to 907-230-2284. So let's start with the conversation between our 4 guests. Lieutenant Governor Meyer, do you want to lead off with questions or comments for our guests from Maine?
Well, yeah, thanks, Scott and Juanita. I appreciate that. And I'd like to just make some preliminary comments, and then, yes, I think Gail and I both have some questions. And Matt, I appreciate the nice comments, and I do miss our person-to-person Secretary of State meetings that we used to have. Now we do everything by Zoom. Hopefully not much longer. And Alaska is unique. I think there might be 3 or 4 other states where the Lieutenant Governor also serves as the Secretary of State. So I guess I benefit in the sense that I get to attend both meetings, Lieutenant Governors and Secretary of State. So we only have 643 days until the general election, and we have so much to learn yet about the ranked choice of voting and reprogramming our election management system, our equipment, and to execute a statewide voter education program. We held several hearings before the general election, before this initiative was brought before the people to vote on. And frankly, and these were statewide, albeit by Zoom. But unfortunately, I was a little disappointed because there just wasn't many questions. And so I'm not sure Alaskans know either what this is going to entail. And certainly Gail and I are trying to learn as much as we can. And the more we can learn from Maine, and I appreciate all the time you've given us so far, Matt, but again, we're going to have more questions for you and Representative Bailey as we go forward. I believe Maine is the only other state that does the ranked choice voting. There are some cities that apparently have tried it as well, but again, it's nice to be able to focus on another state. So we're fortunate to have Maine and your help in going forward. And so it's also good to see, Matt, that if things don't work out for me here as Secretary of State or Lieutenant Governor that perhaps I can get a job as a state auditor, although I'm certainly not qualified for that.
Me neither.
Okay, well, good. Yeah, I guess we can all learn.
Working on it.
Great. Yeah. So, and again, I appreciate you guys. I know it's almost time for you to go home back east. Just one thing I was going to bring up, and I don't think this even pertains to Maine, but in Alaska, we do our primaries a little strange. We have the Republican Party. We have two ballots. You can either ask for the Republican ballot or the Democrat ballot. And the Democrat ballot is pretty much open to anybody and everybody. The Republican ballot, you either have to be a member of the Republican Party and or undeclared and nonpartisan, which frankly is about 60% of our population. So, the Republican ballot, close to 80% of people can choose that one. But now we'll just have one ballot. And people will no longer be running as Republican or Democrat, as I understand how this is going to work. And Gail knows more than I. So we'll have one ballot. So that'll make our job easier because, again, when people went to the primary, the election workers had to ask, well, which ballot do you want? And that was a little confusing. And on the ballot, you don't even have to indicate your party affiliation. I think Gail had mentioned to me that that will be optional. If you want to put down that you're a Republican, you can. If you're a Democrat, you can. Or if you don't want to put down anything, that's fine as well. So, for example, if we have 8 people running for U.S. Senate or Congress, which isn't unusual. I think even in my lieutenant governor's race, we had 6 or 7. But what will happen then is the top 4 vote getters in the primary will automatically go to the general. And again, you don't know if they're all Republicans or all Democrats or all nonpartisan. And what's really going to be interesting is it's my understanding for governor and lieutenant governor, we will have to decide up front that we're going to run as a team. And then you're going to vote for that team. And the top 4 teams for governor and lieutenant governor then go to the general, where then people will rank us 1 through 4. The good news, I think, is, again, Gail and I have only had preliminary discussions on this. We're still trying to get through the last election. I think we pretty much got that behind us. But it's my understanding that our voting machines can be programmed to do the ranking for us. I think what's going to be a challenge for us is that we have probably over 100 precincts, mostly in our rural, remote areas, that actually hand count the ballots the night of the election and then call in the results to us. And then, of course, we also recount 1 precinct in every district after the election and before we certify. And then, of course, if the election is close, people can ask for a recount, and the recount can either be, again, running back through the machine or a hand count. And then this year in particular, people wanted the hand counts. And we also, on this measure, because it was pretty close, I think it passed by only 2 or 3%, Gail will know for sure. People had asked for a recount of this as well. And again, we did it all by hand, which is very time consuming on a statewide basis. And in this case, where you've got people voting basically for 4 people or ranking 4 people, I think that's the biggest challenge I see, and that would be my question to you is how does that really slow things down when you do hand counts? Otherwise, again, I think we can program our machines. What are the problems with initiatives? And I don't believe Maine allows initiatives.
We do.
You do. Okay. I know there's 24 states that do, and there's 26 that do not. One of the problems is that when people get the signatures and it gets on the ballot, there is really not much discussion on what it's going to cost to implement the initiative that then later is law. And that's why I like the legislative process so well, is because you discuss the pros and cons and you balance the cost with the benefits. In this case, that didn't happen. That doesn't happen with initiatives. And so I think Gail had told me she estimates that it's going to cost us about $1.3 million to implement this new system. Again, there's going to be a lot of training, education, supplies, materials, reprogramming of our various programs, unlike Maine, we don't have a whole lot of extra money. I'm sure you don't either. I'm just kidding. But we're going to have to find it, and hopefully the legislature will give us and appropriate that money, and we'll start the process. But yeah, we do have a lot of challenges. We certainly have more than 100 days, like you had, Matt, and Gail and I look forward to working very closely with you going forward. So I guess, Scott, to keep with your format, my question would be, and I would certainly like Gail to voice her comments too, is the hand count part and how much that slows you down. But again, thank you guys for joining us.
Well, I can certainly answer those questions. And actually, our situation is not dissimilar to Alaska's, where we're pretty far flung. I was chair of the Census Complete Count Committee last year, and vast swaths of Maine, according to the census, are counted as Alaska because it's so similar. We have 9,000 people that live in a geographic area equivalent to the states of Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and I think Vermont, and at least half of New Hampshire. So it's a pretty rural area in many places. And this is one of the things that we had to contemplate was, how do you do the rankings? Because rankings in a small town in northern Maine aren't going to have any real relevance to rankings, say, in Portland or Kennebunk, some of the southern Maine more urbane areas. So, that was something that we had to think about, and really only made sense in terms of doing it in one cascade. And that necessitated gathering everything together. And this is, it actually went a lot quicker than we projected. We took the memory devices from our tabulating machines, and our tabulating machines, I think, are somewhat different, or at least of a different manufacturer than Alaska's. But they probably operate off of many of the same principles. The tabulators that we use actually take an image of the entire ballot. And that way you can determine voter intent much more easily, because voters tend to not follow the instructions on the ballot, right? They don't fill the oval, they'll circle a name, or they'll write no next to something that they don't want, that type of thing. And we are able to compensate for that using this technology. So, in terms of those hand count communities, and we have about 240 communities in Maine that count their ballots by hand. And these are communities typically smaller than, 700 or 1,000 voters. What we would do if we had to do a congressional ranking or a legislative ranking, or even a statewide ranking, like a U.S. Senate race or a race for governor, we'd gather everything. We'd get the memory devices from the tabulator towns and upload those images into a closed loop system where the algorithm was housed that would actually is a sorting algorithm. It sounds very fancy and computerized. It's basically an Excel spreadsheet. It just drops things into categories based on what it reads off of the ballots. The cast vote records, which represent how the voter marked their ballot. In terms of those hand count ballots, we actually gather the tamper-proof containers that are padlocked and sealed by the local election officials. We used bonded couriers to bring them to the Capitol, and we brought them in waves and returned them in waves. And we go through the public process of opening those ballot boxes, sorting the ballots, and feeding them through a high-speed tabulator to get the same images that were already on those ballot image devices that we got from the tabulator towns. Once everything was loaded in, we were able to run the algorithm and get the cascade. This whole process took about 10 days. And to your point, Mr. Lieutenant Governor, regarding certifying an election, I mean, this is something that we face from time to time, a statewide recount. In fact, we had, when I say we, I'm not part of that anymore, but the small town of Hudson discovered to their horror that they failed to tabulate 240 absentee ballots. This is all caught in the reconciliation of the election. So they did a final recount, if you will, a final reconciliation, and that will result ultimately in an amended tabulation being presented to the governor here in a couple of weeks that will have the same force and effect as the tabulation that was issued to the governor 20 days after the polls closed back in November. So we have that capacity for amended tabulations, and I will note a curiosity about our initiative process. You can amend statute by using an initiative. You cannot amend the Constitution, and the reason for that, and Representative Bailey may not know this, is that when we began talking about an initiative process back in 1908, Maine was the first state to embrace prohibition, and the Solons and Augusta were terrified at the prospect that the unwashed would move to repeal prohibition by a constitutional amendment. So they made sure they didn't have that tool within their grasp. Obviously, that's now gone by the wayside, but that's why we cannot amend the Constitution by citizen initiative. But the processes that you question, Lieutenant Governor Meyer, these are really mechanical processes, and I think we found that there are ways through that. Maine is not anywhere near. I think we were probably about the size of Prudhoe Bay compared to the rest of Alaska, but nonetheless, there are mechanisms that you can employ to do this, and I think we found that we can do it in a timely manner.
Great, thank you, Matt.
Yeah, the only thing I would really add, I mean, Matt did a great job sort of explaining how it worked in Maine. The only thing I would add is, the initial fiscal note on implementing ranked choice voting in Maine, I think, was something around $1.5 million, if I remember correctly from the original initiative. It ended up being significantly less than that, in part because Matt was very resourceful with the budget that he had and figured out a way to do this efficiently. And also, I think because a lot of the nonprofit community and foundations stepped in to do a lot of voter education. So especially as you're implementing ranked choice voting in, a challenging, and there's other reforms that were part of this package, I know too, implementing these reforms in this sort of challenging budget year, might think about how to partner with the nonprofit community. And I'm sure you already do this, but especially outreaching, of course, in a state like yours, rural communities, Native Alaskan communities, and others, you'll do a lot of that work anyways, right? But I think there might be really opportunities to partner with those foundations and bring in resources through partners to do some of that voter education if there's a strap for cash at the state level. And, something that Matt and I never really even talked about, but might be curious for Alaska folks to chat with as well, is there are a number of southern states that use ranked choice voting for military and overseas ballots. I know Louisiana has done that since 1993. Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, I think Arkansas all use ranked choice voting for overseas and military voters because those are states that have actual runoff elections. And so they use ranked choice voting for those voters to enfranchise them fully in the process, as some of them through court order. So it might be interesting to have some conversations with some of those Secretary of States and folks to think about if there's any best practices or things to look at from those points of view as well.
Yeah, good point. Thank you.
I'd only add that I put in the chat a link to our Maine's ranked choice voting resource page at the Secretary of State's office. One of the things that they did not give us, when I say they, I mean the legislature, was any resources for public education, to Representative Bailey's point. So we came up with an animated cartoon to kind of explain how it works. You will note in private mockery that it looks like I have much more hair than I truly do in my cartoon avatar. That was a nod from the communications people at the Secretary of State's office, but it does explain how it worked. And that was something that folks really, really liked. And like to Representative Bailey's point, voters are smart, right? They want to do the right thing. They'll think about this stuff. And it was not that mysterious in terms of how to use the ranked choice voting ballot. And we got very, very few complaints about the grid style ballot and how it worked. So, and he's right, the nonprofit sector was very helpful. We tried to make sure that because we made sure that we reviewed a lot of their material before they put it out, just to make sure they weren't saying something that was not true. And they were great partners that way. They allowed us to do that.
So, Ms. Fenumiai, do you have any questions that you have for our guests?
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, I do have a couple questions. So the video was mentioned about voter education and outreach. I was wondering if you have had any other components of the voter outreach plan, and if you could identify what you say worked well and what didn't work well.
Well, we had no budget, so we couldn't really go too much farther than that. We could, the League of Women Voters was great. They put out a whole sort of a tabloid type publication that sort of would explain how it worked. It gave some sample ballots, very much closely based on what we did. But again, I mean, I had a conversation with the Senate president at the time, who said, "Look, I know this puts you in a tough place, but we're not giving you any money for this. We don't want it." So that's what you're left with, right? So, you know, we described it in the office as the Apollo 13 scenario. I mean, we had to work with only the resources that we had. And to Representative Bailey's point, we initially estimated this to cost us something like $2.5 million to build an entirely new election system, possibly, you know, and we were thinking like, what would be a foolproof way of implementing this, you know, and that would be to take all the variables out of it and make sure every community had a tabulating machine, which really didn't make a lot of sense. I mean, tabulators are expensive. Even the lease is expensive. And we have some small communities with fewer than 16 voters. It would not make a lot of sense to spend $5,000 on a tabulating machine where, you know, the hand count, ironically, would probably be faster. But then, and then, maybe you talked about leasing high-speed tabulators and locating those regionally to sort of, make the tabulation a little easier, because that was off the table. Even utilizing the historic resource of state police to bring together, the election materials was off the table when the governor said no way. And we thought we were sunk at that point. We even talked about deputizing town clerks as deputy secretaries of state and enjoining them to bring us their election materials with no reimbursement, which would have been really popular in a big rural state like Maine. And the bonded couriers got us off the hook there. They were a quarter of the cost of state police. So we fell into some lucky holes, but a lot of it was just thinking through the problem. Maine's a maritime state, much like Alaska. And I always think of the fella down on the coast who built a boat in his garage, right? He builds a boat, a lobster boat. Didn't think about the height of the door. And when he put it up on the wheels to move it out, he had neglected to account for the extra foot in clearance. And he took it off the wheels and thought about it for a couple of days and realized bacon is pretty slippery. So he puts strips of bacon under the keel and slides it out of the garage without having to cut a hole in his garage. And I think that's the type of problem solving that you have to do in a situation like Maine had. I think Alaska's much better postured than we were. So, when I first described this, and Kevin may remember this, and I came to the summer conference in 2018, after we had done ranked choice voting for that first primary, I believe I opened my presentation with the statement that the fact that I'm even there was proof that we had succeeded, because if I had failed, I was not going to be Secretary of State anymore. And that's what we really deal with. And I think Gail's question really speaks to this. You deal with public trust, right? That's your stock in trade as an election official is the fact that people trust the results of the election. And everything you build is predicated on that, whether it's, the grid style ballot or how you gather materials. And to the Lieutenant Governor's question about how long this takes, we didn't know. We had no idea how long it was going to take. And we couldn't tell people how long it was going to take us to get it done that first time. But what we could do is tell them where we were at every given day. We would say, okay, we've gotten election materials from 95 towns. We've uploaded this many towns, memory devices, we've scanned this many towns, ballots, we have this many to go. And that was sort of the running total that we kept up every day. And as long as people know what's happening, they tend to trust what you're doing. It's when there's a lack of information that rumor and fear rush in to fill the void. And then people start questioning the integrity of the process, which is a really critical lesson from what we did. Transparency is very much your friend here.
So follow up. So the hand count precincts, did Did they report even any results on election night, or did you wait till the ballots were collected and brought to your location to be fed through the high-speed scanners?
That's an excellent question. And one of the key things that we did is run the election the way we always run the election, which is town clerks would report the first place totals only. So it'd be just like any other election night. So if Kevin Meyer was in the lead by, 78%, which would be a poor showing for the lieutenant governor in a state like Maine, then you'd be done, right? But let's just say that Representative Bailey throws his hat in the ring and it's, say, 41-38 with a third party picking up the rest. Well, you know where you stand. You know where you stand with your first place votes. Now, that's not official. Those are apparent results. They're not official till we certify them. But that's enough information for us as a state to begin the process. We give the towns a day to sort of finalize their preliminary returns and make sure we haven't missed anything. And then we send out the couriers, usually the Thursday after the election, to start gathering everything. So yes, on election night, you at least have the first place votes so people know where things stand at the outset.
Okay. Another question. I think before when I spoke with you, you mentioned that your absentee ballots have to be received by close of polls on election day. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. In Alaska, we have up until 15 days following the general election for them to be received. So we're tackling that issue to determine, when the actual rounds of ranked choice voting could start, if they are needed in any race.
Well, the critical thing, Gail, is getting everything entered in. Once you get everything entered in, running the total takes seconds.
Right.
So if you had to wait, to get those last absentee ballots in for 15 days, however you can communicate that. And then again, I mean, you take, a polling place like, Nome, right? That's quite a ways away. Getting that information, to Anchorage or wherever you're doing your totals will take a little bit of time. And if you can account for that, and again, tell people where you are, the actual election totals are relatively simple to run once you have everything entered in.
Okay, thank you.
I think was great about watching the process unfold from 2018 to 2022 in Maine was the improvements that the Secretary of State's office continued to make with rulemaking. I mean, you learn as you go, right? And so you have a sort of a model in Maine to be able to look at and adapt for your own state, because the Secretary here did such a good job of implementing with the election administrators. And the time window also shrunk from the initial election to subsequent elections. I think there's other states that are certainly having some serious conversations about moving in this direction too, and some of them don't have some of the broadband internet challenges that we have in places like Maine, which you may have some of those challenges in a large rural state like Alaska in terms of transmitting. We also have a statute that prevents the electronic transmission of election results. So I think some states will have different platforms to be able to transfer some of that data, at least preliminarily, to go through that process, even if they have a back-end process similar to Maine's to verify that process, which I think will also continue to improve the timeline for delivery. But this was a conversation that was part of the campaigns here too, and I imagine it was there as well, was how long are we going to have to wait? And voters ultimately decided that they're more interested in the outcomes than even if they have to wait a few days for the results. But I think those things are continuing to improve with the technology advances and as more states implement, even as we saw in Maine, right, the vendors suddenly that wanted to compete and knew that there was something happening on this issue suddenly decided to make advancements in their own technology to prepare for other states and other places to adopt this more broadly. So, kudos to Alaska for being on the frontier of this issue along with Maine. I think rightfully so that the two states that reach out into either corner of our country are setting the precedent for the others to follow. So it'll be exciting to see the work that you all do there. And of course, we want to be as helpful as we possibly can.
Well, thank you, Representative Bailey. We're running a little bit close to the end of our program, so I wanted to reserve a little bit of time for questions from the audience. Gail, do we have any questions? I'm sorry, not Gail, Juanetta. Apologize for that.
That's okay. Gail might be better at moderating this, but I'll give it a shot. So we do have questions for our guests from Maine as well as for our Alaska officials. And again, for the audience, just as a reminder, there's no guarantee that your question will be asked. There's no guarantee that we'll ask it exactly as you posed it. I try and curate these and combine similar questions. I'm going to start with our Alaska-based questions. There's one of the aspects of our election processes is that candidates can bypass the primaries through a petition process. And there's a couple of questions about whether or not that will still continue to be an option to bypass the primary through the petition process. Gail, you want to take that one on? You're muted, Gail. There you go.
Sorry about that. Always happens. It's my understanding nominating petition candidates will no longer be a method of accessing the ballot, and everybody will funnel through the primary election, and the top 4 will then advance to the general election ballot.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Another question has to do with the notion now that governor and lieutenant governor candidates will have to run as pairs, and will it be possible for for example, I guess on either side, either a governor or a lieutenant governor to pair with more than one option so that they appear on the ballot more than once?
That's probably something, I mean, the way the law works right now is that you're not filing as a candidate for office in, under more than one party. So I would have to just say, first blush, that would not be allowed. You pair up in the primary, you run as a team. Again, I would like to consult with our legal advisors about that, but my understanding is that would not be the case. It's not the case now.
Okay. Thank you. A couple of questions for our guests from Maine. In terms of your primary elections, now your ranked choice voting option is just for your statewide elections for Congress and for the president, as I understand it. Do candidates appear on your ballot with their party identified?
Yes, they do. So, because of the injunction in the Constitution that the state general election, and that's the election for the legislature and for governor, is decided by a plurality of the votes cast. That ran in afoul in an advisory opinion from the state Supreme Court that if ranked choice voting was challenged constitutionally on the basis of plurality, it would probably be struck. So the legislature amended the original initiative and backed out the state general elections for the legislature and the governor. So we only use ranked choice voting in the general election for federal races. We use it for all state and federal races in the primary because our Constitution does not describe either primaries or federal elections. That's how finally we break it down. So, but yes, party affiliations are on the ballot for all county, state, and federal races, not for municipal races. So that is part of the law as we administer it.
And I think just to be clear too, for folks in Alaska, your state has adopted the top 4. Pick one candidate in the primary, and then advances to the general election where ranked choice voting is then used. Maine does not have an open primary system. That's not a component of ours. We still have partisan primaries. So ranked choice voting is used in those partisan primaries, and then it's used again in the general election. So you get the Democratic nominee, the Republican Party nominee, the Green Party nominee, any independents or write-in candidates, et cetera. Just to clarify.
All right, thanks for that clarification. We did have a couple of questions along those lines, so I think that's helpful. We have some questions with regard to the outcomes of ranked choice voting in terms of both voter behavior and campaign finance. I know that I don't believe that the dark money component that was included in our ballot measure 2 was included in your ranked choice voting initiative. But, just a question in general, how have the cost of campaigns been impacted by ranked choice voting? Has it gone up or down, or do you see any discernible impact?
Well, it's gone up. I don't know if it's related to ranked choice voting. Our recent U.S. Senate race, Representative Bailey, I think it topped somewhere around 150 or 160 million dollars, something like that. Unbelievable numbers, but that had nothing to do with ranked choice voting. That was kind of the nature of the race. I think it's a little early to tell whether or not campaign finance will be impacted by ranked choice voting, and sometimes these things trend over 20 or more years. We went to no excuse absentee balloting in 1999, and prior to that, you had to have a reason to get an absentee ballot. Had to swear out an affidavit. I'm sure Gail would have loved filing those. But as a result, absentee ballot turnout as a component of the entire turnout was less than 5%. Since we opened it up to anybody who wanted an absentee ballot, prior to this past election, it was about 35% of turnout. And because of the pandemic, it was more, almost doubled. We had something over 60% turnout by absentee balloting. Now, that changes the way campaigns conduct their business. You can't hold back a bunch of resources for your so-called Halloween surprise anymore, especially if half of your voters have already voted. You need to have a steadier campaign with a more sustained message over a longer period of time. So I think in a like manner with ranked choice voting, we've already seen this. We've already seen candidates get together in campaign TV ads and say, if you're going to vote for Representative Bailey as your first choice, pick me as your second choice, and vice versa. And, in terms of how that adds to civility, again, that's a little early to say. The third parties have not learned how to be civil. They're still throwing axes at everybody. The outside unaffiliated organizations who just hate Matt Dunlap, well, they have not slowed down boiling cauldrons of oil. So in that regard, it's a little early to say how that's going to affect civility as well. But it's, in terms of the campaign finance, I don't think this last Senate race is a very good sample to draw from for experience.
Well, and another thing, Representative Bailey, you kind of suggested this in some of your opening remarks, that the rancor of political campaigns, and Mr. Dunlap just spoke to that a little bit, but also you spoke a bit about voter fatigue from the tenor of those kinds of elections. Are you seeing changes? Are we changing one kind of fatigue for another kind of fatigue, the fatigue brought on by rancorous elections versus maybe the fatigue of having to know more about multiple candidates in order to be an informed voter? Or what are you seeing along those lines?
I think that's a good question. I think, the point for a moment about the campaign finance, ranked choice voting is not a campaign finance reform. Where it intersects campaign finance, I think, is in that it levels the playing field for candidates who have some good ideas and who can get on the debate stage, but maybe aren't the most well-financed candidates. If they can convince voters that they're the best person for the job, they suddenly have a path to victory that perhaps may have been more challenging under a sort of a pick one system. I think that what we've seen with ranked choice voting in Maine from a civility factor is, I think almost instantly, I saw voters change the way that they talked about candidates and campaigns and how they engaged with one another about who you were supporting. Who are your top three? Who are your top three? Oh, so-and-so is your first choice. They're my third choice. Why? I really like their healthcare policy position. Or I really like what they had to say about immigration. It was a very sort of a different conversation, a little bit than like the conversation you might have where it's a pick one race and a crowded race, and you're in a room and you ask someone who they're supporting and they're not your candidate, and so you have the choice of, do I try to tell them something about their candidate that they may not know about how awful they are? Do I try to tell them something about my favorite candidate, how much better they are on an issue I think they care about, or do I disengage from the conversation? that's sort of the incentive under the pick one system. And that's different with ranked choice voting, which is this much more like, who are your top three? Who are your top three? And it's a different conversation. I think the parties, PACs, and politicians are a little slow to pick up the changes that come with ranked choice voting, although we have seen hints of it. I think particularly in party primaries, where we've seen candidates seeing an advantage to trying to reach out and build consensus. I do think we're so polarized and so in our partisan camps in a lot of ways that it's going to take a little time for reforms like ranked choice voting to settle in and people to see the impacts. Although there are examples where candidates, even in Maine, the second congressional district race that the secretary alluded to earlier, a challenger defeated an incumbent. The incumbent in that race said, don't rank your choices, only rank me. The challenger in that race reached out to the voters who ranked one of the third-party candidates and said, if I can't be your first choice, I'd like to be your second choice because I want to represent you too. And so I think that candidate campaigned more to how you change ranked choice voting and benefited as a result of it. And so I think the more examples that there are like that, the more the consulting class will catch up and understand that, you can't just take out the same old playbook and reap in the cash that you've made cutting television ads. You really need to start changing the way you run those campaigns to be more, to reach out beyond your base. And I would say even in our very competitive U.S. Senate general election this year, Susan Collins won the ranked choice voting election with an outright majority. There was a Green and a Democrat, and they happened to do communications with their voters about educating voters about ranked choice voting and making it your first choice. And they were adopting that language because they understood the benefit. The Green Party candidate, I think, understood the benefit of trying to attract first choice rankings. The Democrat in the race, instead of saying this person's a spoiler, don't waste your vote, was suddenly saying, I like some of their ideas, but I hope you'll make me your second choice. So in that ways, it's a subtle change that's going to start to catch on more and more. And it's not a silver bullet. It doesn't eliminate negative campaigning, but it can help get at that problem.
And I know we're over time, Juanita, but I just would add that, in terms of what the net effect is for voters, right? And even for those running for public office, it eliminates the spoiler effect. And you go back to the 1992 presidential election, election observers would say Bill Clinton won because Ross Perot was in that race. And he siphoned votes away from George H.W. Bush. Now, of course, we all know how that turned out. In Maine, we've had, a small Green Party for quite a few years. And when I was in the legislature on the Redistricting Commission, I can tell you that the Green Party was pretty much an open collusion with the Republican Party. The Republicans would organize for them and recruit candidates for them, specifically because if you had a competitive district, you had a Green Party candidate and a Democratic candidate, they would split the vote and the Republican could win that legislative election. That's not as possible now if people actually rank their choices in a ranked choice election. So it allows for a more, like I say, it allows people to say, I'm really glad I got to vote for that Green Party candidate that I admired without risking electing someone who's completely opposite of my political philosophies. And I think that's what ranked choice voting ultimately achieves for the voter.
Great. Thank you. I do have just one last question I'd like to get to, and apologize for those questions that we haven't gotten to, but because we are coming up on a period of redistricting and setting new legislative districts, and then having also this new ranked choice voting process, what do you think that Alaska can do to help smooth out the bumps in that combined process of redistricting and a changing electoral process?
Well, having served on both an apportionment commission and as an elections administrator, I can tell you they're really not related. So, how you go about building legislative districts, there's 1,000 ways to cut a legislative district. There are rules for doing it. I think if you follow the philosophy of creating competitive districts where people have a fighting chance regardless of where they come from, and then focus as a party official on recruiting strong candidates, because really this is the reality. Nobody relishes the idea of running for the legislature and getting yelled at in the grocery store every Saturday, right? For, you know, relatively small pay. You have to ask people to do it. But I think if you think about the consensus building component of ranked choice voting, and then as a commission, and I don't know how Alaska does its redistricting, I know how we do it, and we try to build consensus. If you come up with competitive districts that, you know, whether you're Matt Dunlap, Kevin Meyer, or Kyle Bailey, you have a fighting chance at that, especially in a ranked choice election. I think the two actually can walk side by side and provide a better representative government for the people of Alaska.
And I just would add to that too, and the secretary had said this before as well, but sort of bringing this back to voters and what ranked choice voting means for voters. You know, empowering voters with more choice, being able to walk into that voting booth and express your true preferences about the candidates and not having to be a political strategist and think, what do the most recent polls say? Who's the most viable candidate? I don't want to waste my vote. Is this candidate really a spoiler? Those are sort of evaluations go out the window, and you can actually address the ballot and say, who do I think would make the best governor, lieutenant governor, U.S. senator, U.S. congressperson? They're my first choice. If my first choice couldn't win, who I think would do a decent job? And then who would I think would do a halfway decent job? And you can express those true rankings. And at the end of the day, it's not some political party in Juneau or Washington, D.C. that gets to build a coalition. It's the voters casting their ranked choice ballot that get to build that majority coalition, decide who is the consensus candidate. And so you don't have to worry about, the vote splitting and the spoiler dynamics, and all that goes out the window. And you can just have a straight up conversation about who's going to do the best job, who's going to represent me, and I can just cast my ballot that way. You know, I know some voters say they do that now, but a lot of voters, if they're being honest, think strategically about what's going on in the election and not wanting to waste their vote. And elections can sometimes have outcomes where candidates win who may be opposed by a majority of voters under a pick one system. Ranked choice voting does away with that. And at the end result, you get a governor who gets a majority support, who legislators can't say, oh, well, we have more of a mandate than they have. You get a congressperson who's going to go to Washington, D.C., who got elected not just with throwing red meat out to their 35% of the vote, their base, but had to reach out for a second and maybe even third choice rankings. And when they sit at the negotiating table across from the other political party, has to think about, how am I going to get reelected? And it's not just about trying to, go through, especially in your top four non-party primary situation, but trying to go through, trying to sow that needle, but actually being able to think about, how do I get things done and produce a result that at the end of the day, a majority of Alaskans will reelect me to office under this system. So that I think is the game changer.
Great. Well, thank you all for your patience with the questions. I know we've gone a little bit over time. I do want to just add that there were some questions and comments that we didn't get to. I want to just assure the audience that the structure of the program was not a consideration of what party anybody is affiliated with, that we really just tried to reach out to the people that were most involved with the ranked choice voting process. And I thank you for your comments. And I suspect that we probably will be doing more programs on this process as we move through it over the next few years. And in the interest of hearing other voices, we'll reach out to other folks as well to learn more about how ranked choice voting initiatives have impacted voting processes in Maine and in other jurisdictions. So with that, let me turn back to Scott for any final closing comments. Scott?
Thanks, Vanetta. I just want to thank our guests again today. It's been an interesting conversation, and we appreciate your comments. I also just want to thank all of our members and friends for joining us today. And again, if you're not a member of Commonwealth North, please feel free to join us. Our next program will be on February 24th at noon with University of Alaska statewide interim president Pat Pitney Ms. Pitney will present a State of the University address outlining the current circumstances and